Hey everybody, so the first chapter we talked about the culture, and it sort of gives you a feel about what Texans, how we became to be Texans and why everything's bigger in Texas and who we are as a state. And today in chapter 2, we're going to talk about the federal system and how that interacts with our state. I mentioned before that usually if your state politics is different than the national politics, there's going to be a lot of tension and strife. And we, as a red state and a Republican state, a conservative state, we've had a lot of tensions with the national government if it's a Democrat president. For instance, we have just become the first state to sue the Biden administration. And then in prior administrations with President Trump, California, because the President Trump and California have different politics, just like Texas and President Biden have different politics. So that's how it comes into play. So today we're going to cover chapter 2. It's the federal system. We're going to talk about different types of government. Then we're going to distinguish among the types, the powers within their governments, and Texas's relationship with the federal government. And right now we are already seeing that it's going to be a little bit of tension, again, because of the difference in philosophies, platforms, politics. And then how Texas will move forward with 4 years under President Biden, and how Texas has in the past moved forward whenever there was a different type of government. So let's talk about unitary systems. That's a type of government in where your constitution rests with the national or central government. And so any regional governments are going to be subordinate to the national government. That's called unitary. So in a unitary system, the national government is supreme, and any other government underneath that, state, regional, any type of government is a subordinate of it. And that's called a unitary system. And then we have definition of a confederal system. And in a confederal system, the government, the member states or regional governments have most of the authority. So it's the opposite of what a unitary government is. So again, a confederal system is where your states and your regional governments are supreme and have the most authority. European Union is the best example of a confederal system. So the union in Europe, the European Union, they are the best example of a successful confederal system. So when we say, let's talk about the federal system, we're talking about a system of governments in which the power is divided and shared. And that power is divided and shared between the national, central, and state governments. And examples of that could be, for instance, we take federal funding for highways, for our infrastructure. We take federal funding for higher education. And that's an example where your state government, the state of Texas, and the national government both come together and provide funds or resources for the general common good of the state of Texas. So that's an example of federal system. So in addition to us, the U.S., federal systems are also used in Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, and Mexico. So those are all examples of a federal system. And what is federalism? Again, where the national government and the state government will work together for the common good of the residents. It could be either through funding and or resources. So the U.S. is a good example, just like the European Union was the example we used before. The U.S. is a good example of a successful federal system. And again, other examples are Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, and Mexico. So, in our federal system, we have something called delegated powers. And those are powers that the Constitution will give to the national government. Let me repeat that. So, we have something called delegated powers, and that's where the powers that the Constitution specifically gives to the national government. These powers are found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Again, delegated powers are powers that are specifically given through the Constitution to the national government. And in the Constitution, it is found in Article 1, Section 8. We also have something called express powers. And it's exactly what it sounds like. These are powers that are virtually expressed in the Constitution. Then we have something called implied powers, and that's exactly how it sounds. It is implied in the Constitution. So the implied powers specifically, they're delegated powers that are assumed that exist in order for the federal government to perform functions that they have to perform. So let me repeat that again. Implied powers are those powers that are just under the assumption that it exists in order for the federal government to perform the functions that it needs to perform. Okay, moving on, if I can find my cursor. Sorry about that. We also have something called reserved powers. Those powers belong to the states. So first we covered powers that belong to the national government. Reserved powers are powers that belong specifically to the states. And these powers, the legitimacy of it all, comes in the 10th Amendment. So they're found in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Concurrent powers. Exactly what it sounds like. It's powers that are shared by the national government and the states. It's concurrent. So it probably would be best for you to rewind, because I specifically went over each power, where they are and where they can be found. So it can be familiar, you can be familiar with it. Because if you're just hearing this for the first time, it's like, what? But if you rewind, I'm very specific as to which powers belong to the national government, which powers belong to the state government, and where they can be found in the Constitution, because you will need to know that again coming up in a test. Okay, we're still sticking with our federal system, and remember I commented on the other countries that use federal systems, including Mexico. So the types of powers that we can continue to find in the federal system is something called a supremacy clause. The states, so in a supremacy clause in our Constitution, these are laws and treaties created that will supersede the state constitution. So I didn't say that clearly. Let me repeat it and be more clear. Supremacy clause, and a lot of these are exactly how they sound, okay? So a supremacy clause means that if there's a conflict between a state law or clause and a national law or clause, the national clause trumps, pun intended, the state clause. So it's more supreme. So a supremacy clause is exactly what it says. That's when the U.S. Constitution, and it's in the U.S. Constitution, is when a U.S. law will supersede a state and or a local law. Okay. So you have a very, very good figure in your textbook. It is figure 2.1. And it shows examples of what delegated national powers, reserved state powers, and those are shared powers. For instance, delegated and national powers to raise arms, declare war. That is something only at the national level that can be done. Reserved state powers, conduct elections. All the elections that we conduct, that is a state power. That is not a national power. Each state has its own laws for conducting elections. And we saw that firsthand with this last election because we saw how quickly some states counted their votes. We saw how some states allowed a certain number of mail-in votes, and you could mail in votes on a certain number of characteristics, versus Texas, where you have to have a certain amount of ID and we're more stringent, right? So each state has its own set of laws when it comes to conducting elections. That is an example of a reserved power of the state. A shared or concurrent power, taxes. Both the national government and the state government, they want our money. So they both have the power to levy taxes against us. What else? Charter banks. Some banks are national, some are state. That's a power by both. So figure 2.1 is very good in your textbook because it tells you specifically what is only a national power, and then it tells you what is only a reserved or state power, and then it tells you what is shared or concurrent. So be familiar. For instance, if I say on an exam, what is a concurrent power? Be able to identify what they are. Okay, moving on. One of the best powers, of course, declaring war. And I don't know, best maybe not the correct adjective I should be using, but one of the most exclusive important powers, that's better, is declaration of war. But another one is also commerce. So in a commerce clause, and the specific information and power that we have for the commerce clause, it's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And in the Commerce Clause, it says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce. I tell you, I did have coffee again. Sometimes I cannot say what I want to say, but you guys understand. A Commerce Clause, again, it's in Section 8, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, and it's very specific about giving Congress the power to regulate commerce. We talked about NAFTA. That's an example. Any trade that we have in between two states, that's another example. I don't really like to ask you, especially on quizzes or exams, about a lot of lawsuits because I know, one, they're very confusing, and two, this is not a law class. However, there are some that I will ask you to know what the significance from it is because in any other political science class you take, you will hear it again. One of them is McCulloch versus Maryland. In this lawsuit, Chief Justice John Marshall said that it was true that the creation of a bank was not specifically listed in Section 8 of the Constitution because of the supremacy clause. And remember what that is. That means national law trumps state law if there's a conflict, along with the necessary and proper clause, which means there's certain things that have to happen in order for the federal government to actually provide for its residents. Congress has the authority to create a bank. I will repeat that again. So, in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. That's a lawsuit that was filed. Chief Justice John Marshall, in his ruling, he argued that it was necessary to create a bank, even though it wasn't specifically outlined in the Constitution. He said specifically, Section 8 of the Constitution, because of two things, the Supremacy Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. Congress does have the authority to create a bank. So, let's talk a little bit about dual federalism. That's when federal government and state governments are both within their own sphere of influence. So you have the national government, they know their roles. State government, they know their role. And the relation of the two is one of tension more than collaboration. There's a lot of strife. In the state of Texas, probably the most recent example of that would be during the Affordable Health Care Act. During the Affordable Health Care Act, President Obama at the time said, we're going to have universal health care for all the residents, but they passed it with an unfunded mandate. And we're going to learn more about unfunded mandates later on in the semester. But what an unfunded mandate is, it's when the national government says, this is now law, but you, the states, individual states, have to come up with a way to fund it. Well, the state of Texas said, we can't afford to provide all the provisions under the Affordable Health Care Act. And so at that time, there was a little bit of a clash because the national government wanted to provide health care for everyone. And the federal government said, it's not that we don't want to provide for them, we just can't afford to provide for them. So that's called dual federalism. So cooperative federal, and in your textbook, they have all of these phases of federalism, like they have a timeline. In my examples, I'm going to give you just isolated examples. So it's not really going with a timeline, but it's giving you, like I just did with dual federalism, specific and individual examples of when this happened with the national government and with Texas. So dual federalism, as outlined in your textbook, was replaced by cooperative federalism. And that's when the relationship between the federal government, national government, and I will use federal and national interchangeably. So when the federal government, national government, and the state were more cooperative with each other. And in your textbook, they talk about the time when we were going through the Depression and when there was just desperate need for aid. And at the time, they came up with a lot of grants to give the aid. Please go over the grants. They are the definitions are identified in your textbook. Please be familiar with, for instance, a block grant. That's a federal grant that the state or local government will give to maybe a city, but they will have fewer restrictions than, say, another type of grant, which is a categorical grant. So just be familiar with grants. There are many of them listed. Just be familiar with categorical and block. Okay. So we had civil rights. We talked about that a little bit in chapter 1. And we had a lot of issues in the southern states. Another case that you should be familiar with in history and in political science is Plessy versus Ferguson. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal doctrine was the law of the land. So It was a Supreme Court ruling that legalized segregation, that said it is legal for blacks to be in a separate facility than whites. Separate but equal is legal. And that was the result of Plessy versus Ferguson. The difference was, and the problem is, it wasn't quite equal, right? So the facilities that were provided for blacks was not even close to the type of facilities that were provided for non-blacks. And so even though the ruling was separate but equal is legal, we, and when I say we, people who look like me, black people, continued to challenge that ruling. And so we had at that time Jim Crow laws, which meant that the state and local laws, they mandated racial segregation in everything. Everything, where you ate, where you had your schooling. Everything was mandated to be separate, right? And then we had something called Brown versus Board of Education. And of course, during Brown versus Board of Education, we found out that, you know what? We're finding out that these facilities are not quite even close to being equal. And that in itself is not legal. So that's when you saw more of the federal government stepping in and saying, we were giving you an opportunity, states, especially southern states, to do the right thing. You're not doing it, so we may have to come in and enforce certain things. I mentioned unfunded mandates. We talked about the Affordable Health Care Act. Trying to see what else in this chapter I wanted you to. That's about it. This chapter was not, some chapters are pretty interesting. This one was more cut and dry, so you could understand the basics of the Constitution. And as you're reading it, and the reason why I do these videos is because I think, first of all, if you're going to be online, you might as well have the pleasure and leisure of playing the video when you want to. But also because there are things that I'm outlining in these videos, and you may understand it just from my description, but some people will also use my description to help them understand the text. And it's just depends on your choice of how you like to actually comprehend the material. So that's about it for chapter 2. I do like Texas politics only because, for a lot of reasons. Texas is so riveting and different than a lot of other states, and we continue to just be different. And as we go throughout the semester, we'll talk about how people of color are thriving, our businesses are thriving, immigrants. People don't think of Texas as a place for immigrants. I'm an immigrant myself. I don't know if I told you guys that. And coming to this country, you have an opportunity in Texas to really thrive and do your best. And we'll get into the economics behind the state. But for now, this chapter was specifically just to go over some facets of the Constitution, even though we do have a Constitution chapter that will cover all of that. And just to make you familiar with some lawsuits that are impactful and have really determined who we are as a state. So I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. I think it's supposed to be nice this weekend, a little bit of rain. But that's about it. Email me any questions as you're reading material, or there's something you don't understand. Please don't hesitate to email. And like I said, I try to return all emails within 24 hours. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.